Hey everybody, today I am going to be reviewing Full Metal Jacket. This film came out in 1987. It was directed by Stanley Kubrick. I haven't reviewed a Stanley Kubrick film in a while, and I hadn't seen Full Metal Jacket in its entirety in many years. I've seen the first half maybe like 40 times, but in its entirety, it had been a long time ago. I admit that this was never one of my favorite Kubrick films, just compared to the rest of his canon, but I just felt like for whatever reason, now would be a good time to return to it. Even when I struggle with certain films that he makes, there are always moments in it that captivate me, that haunt me, and even the movies that I dislike, I'm always willing to return to them. I remember initially being very mesmerized by certain scenes and certain sequences in the movie, but I remember thinking it was just a little bit disjointed narratively, and emotionally it underwhelmed me. And that's not a big surprise because, if you've watched my channel frequently in the past, I reviewed quite a few Stanley Kubrick films, and the ones that I have issues with, or when I have complaints, that's typically what it is. I do complain about the second half of his career, post-2001: A Space Odyssey, a lot in terms of, his films became more skeletal in nature, just thematically and in terms of the narrative. A lot of the more complex, more humanistic elements that did exist in his films pre-2001: A Space Odyssey are just more removed here, and they feel more distant. It's more of an abstract experience. I don't know, it was just always something about that second half of his career where I just felt like it lost a little bit of that depth that he had more in films like Lolita, which was one of my favorite Kubrick films, and Dr. Strangelove, compared to films like Eyes Wide Shut, which of course was, his final film. And even films like Barry Lyndon, that is one of my all-time favorite Stanley Kubrick films. I do have that same issue in terms of just it losing some of those humanistic elements, and The Shining as well. But returning to it now, after many years, I have to say I felt quite differently about it. I found myself actually really enjoying it and really enjoying parts of the film that maybe I didn't connect to originally. It was the Vietnam section mainly that I found myself struggling with, and this time I found myself really drawn to it. It's all just very haunting, the overall tone of the movie, and just I think that Kubrick has an ability to capture a mood in a way that is beyond most every director out there, and he captures the mood, maybe not necessarily the specificity of characters, but just the mood of what it's like to be one of these young people, like this young guy who's like this jizz-filled, trigger-happy adrenaline junkie. A lot of them aren't even old enough to drink yet, and then they are plunged, into this very scary situation that maybe they wouldn't be prepared for otherwise. And it's that danger, it's the idea of these young, impressionable minds being molded, brainwashed by a society. And yeah, the film, just in terms of the way it builds, it's not very similar to a lot of the movies, maybe a lot of American war films that you might see, especially at the time. And yet I found myself this time actually defending kind of the unorthodox sort of way they build tension, the way they build sympathy. And again, even though you're not tied to these characters in the way that you might normally be if you were, watching a war film that was made by Spielberg, as an example, somehow just the impact of the moment, the immediacy of the moment is more what is effective. Many of the moments do have an ambiguity to them. I think the whole movie does feel kind of like a giant ink blot test where, yes, the fundamental ideas are there, but they're certainly not handed to you. A lot of the color, a lot of the facets that you experience here come from moments of silence, long and drawn out sections where the tone is resting in this very unlikely place, but also a very uncomfortable place. I think, scenes in Kubrick films are some of the best of all time by anybody. And of course, that is not a controversial opinion. Even though thematically this carries a lot of themes that we see in other Kubrick films, I think this one has a particular hard cynicism and a directness that captures the period, that captures the situation. And I think what compels us to keep watching is there's this sort of faint, very quivering human longing that we can sort of detect underneath, that is wanting to poke through. A strength from underneath it that is building the arc, that is building the tension. And, to me, I consider this a sort of loss of innocence story. It's a story of, young boys being forced to become these machines. It's the nature of toxic masculinity as it is enforced on an adolescent on the cusp of manhood. And Kubrick films, like I said, a lot of them share a lot of similar thematic elements. A lot of his movies have to do with boys becoming men, or, fathers and sons. Even, I'm mentioning Barry Lyndon, that is the story of a young, naive boy who is forced into war. You know, he's forced to grow up very fast. And A Clockwork Orange even, you know, is a film that is about a lot of misguided, violent teen angst, and it's kind of brainwashing all of that out of the person. And Full Metal Jacket also just wastes no time plunging you into that feeling, plunging you into that action. It really does feel like really ice cold water has just been splashed on your face. And it's the sort of thing where it's like, wake up, because you're going to have to grow up really fast right now. And even just that opening montage that we see that's kind of, you know, during the opening credits of the movie, I think is really, really powerful. It's very simple, but very powerful. You know, just this montage of Marine recruits all getting their heads shaved. You know, it's like they're instantly losing the identity that they once had. And you never really get a sense of who these people were before they joined the Marines. You know, you don't know how they dressed. You don't really know what their hair looks like. You don't have much indication really of how these people might have expressed themselves before this time period. And, you know, Kubrick movies do have a feeling where it's less about characters and it feels more like a social experiment, some sort of experiment where all of the characters seem more like lab rats than anything else. Nameless people all thrown into a situation where we are not tied to people in the typical way that we might be. The entire sequence on the island where the Marines train, of course, is absolutely iconic. It is the most iconic section of the film, probably, and it's just so good. I mean, it is every single moment, every single frame is absolutely compelling and absolutely methodical too. You know a bomb is going to go off at some point in some form. We just don't know how. And because you're not used to the way that this particular story is being told, you don't know who it's going to be, where it's going to be, why. And as usual, you know, there's a great contrast between what's going on screen and how it's filmed, just the cinematography of everything. The fluidity of the camera is a big thing with Kubrick, and yet also it's very static and it has a very distant nature to it compared to all this blatant yelling and literally watching somebody being broken down and being, you know, becoming a psychopath. Though there is, you know, a small emotional thread to a degree through the character, the protagonist, who is Joker here. And his inner conflict is going to be tested with the character of Private Pyle. And even Cowboy. Cowboy is a character here where, you know, that's going to carry through. We'll see that arc pay off eventually where they reunite once they get to Vietnam. But that whole section, that whole struggle that Joker has, especially when it pertains to Private Pyle, you know, it's just, you know, it's that conflict of wanting to help somebody and knowing it's what you're supposed to do, but also being very torn, losing that sympathy in order to please a collective or in order to join a collective. There, you know, is a tragedy in itself. And naturally, when you make certain decisions like that, the other person's going to get left behind. And that's what happens to Pyle. You know, he is abandoned and discarded in a society that was never going to accept him. And the scene in the bathroom, the very, very famous climactic scene in the first half where Pyle does cross over, is absolutely extraordinary. It's downright bone-chilling, I think. The horror here does become, you know, more cartoonish in a way. It becomes more abstract, more exaggerated to the point where it feels, you know, removed from reality even more. It feels even more surrealistic and more complex tonally. And you have very dark humor going on here that is very reminiscent of The Shining, and, you know, the lighting and everything, and the slow motion is just stunning. The soundtrack is evocative. It's wonderful. And it's Kubrick's ability to stretch out that humor, to keep it going even in the darkest of moments, in the most sterile of environments, I think is really wonderful. It's a great contrast to that bleakness, especially when it comes to the subject matter. It's all of those little manic sort of feelings and in like those weird kind of opposing impulses that we have that he's able to bring out. You know, it's the sense of chaos and pain and hysteria. Again, that is underlying throughout this movie, that is wanting to break through to this cold mechanical exterior. That's what keeps the momentum building. And I know that some people feel like, you know, this feels more like short stories or vignettes rather than like a full, complete narrative. But I kind of like that. I kind of like how you get like these little tastes, tastes of immediacy. Again, just like this external emotion instantly from people that we're not necessarily really tied to. I think it really fits what things are like. It's like, in the middle of war, you run into different people and you spend some time with them and then you move on, and you don't really learn much about them because you don't have the time. And even though, yes, it is exaggerated, as I said, sometimes the performances are exaggerated intentionally. I feel like the American soldiers here and the way that they are portrayed is really, really wonderful. And I feel like it totally captures the reality of things. Because it's not some romanticism of soldiers and of that kind of masculinity. It's more like, no, these are young guys who have no real perspective. And that very impressionable nature of people, graduating from high school and then suddenly having to go to Vietnam, there's just a danger to that. It's not something that, again, people in the 20th century are used to. And especially being groomed to become a killer in a culture, in an American culture that glorifies violence the way it does, especially in pop culture. You do see a lot of pop culture references throughout the movie. John Wayne is a big one, especially with Joker, Mickey Mouse, and Margaret, along with very zeitgeisty kind of rock songs that would have been very popular in the period during the Vietnam era. And some of the irony of certain references here, I think, are maybe a little bit too obvious, a little bit too on the nose, but it's just a nitpick. For Joker, yes, he is a character that is somebody that we're following, and yet we're not necessarily very tied to him. He does remain quite elusive to us. A blank slate so that we can sort of project our own feelings, our own experiences onto it in a fresh, kind of unbiased way. But he's very distinguishable at the same time. He is a smartass, and you get that sense very, very early on. Actually, instantly, you get that sense that he's a smartass, somebody who's maybe not afraid to ruffle feathers at least a little bit, and he's somebody who, I think he thinks a little bit more about things than maybe some of the other soldiers that you see here. And I think he's somebody who really wants to be a good person for the most part, wants to do the right thing until he is confronted with an obstacle that is maybe a little more complex, and then naturally is going to show us a darker side of him. And that is a dark side that I think we are all capable of, even if you are the nicest, most kind person in the world. There is a lot of mirroring in this film, just like there is in most Stanley Kubrick films. I kept thinking about Barry Lyndon as an example. There's so much mirroring in that one that shows us the progression of Barry, especially when you see the mirroring in the duel sequences. You see kind of how far things have come, or haven't, depending on how you look at it. But it's same here, I think, in terms of you seeing the progression in Joker. There's, a huge mirroring from the end of the first half and the end of the second half. Both are sequences that give you a real taste of that ugliness and, certain decisions that we are faced with, even though we don't want to be faced with them, that can haunt us forever. And again, with Pyle, there's that confrontation, but at the end, when he is faced, with mortality, with the sniper, yet again at the end, I think he fully loses that innocence. It's a vulnerable position for both of them, and ultimately, he chooses, because he's in control, he chooses to end things. And so, I think the reason why it is so cynical and why it does feel so dark is because, yes, it is about boys becoming cold-blooded killers, but it's like mentally they never graduated, because that part takes time. So it's like you have a bunch of like man boys walking around. It's like people who have these big weapons and can do all kinds of destruction because they're given this power, but they're very virile, very volatile people, very lost. And a lot of them, you get a sense of their motivations. Most of them have no real idea what they're doing and why they're fighting. And, there's just something very unhealthy about a lot of those responses that you see. And Kubrick just captures that melancholy, I think, that sadness in a very beautiful way. I think the final set piece, the whole section where they have to face the sniper in the end, is just fantastic. It is impeccably shot, and I just love the colors. I love, Kubrick's use of color is absolutely extraordinary, especially that contrast of the bright flames, like the yellow flames, and the blue of night. He loves to do a lot of contrast with yellows and blues. It's hilarious that none of this was shot in Vietnam. Not a single frame of this movie was shot in Vietnam. It was all shot in Kubrick's backyard. It was shot in Europe because, as a lot of people know, Kubrick was a recluse, and he would not travel and deal with all of that when it comes to film production if he didn't have to. And he certainly didn't have to by this point in his career. And some people complain about that. Some people think that it is a detriment to the film, not really capturing the ambiance of Vietnam. And I actually totally disagree with that. I love that they didn't shoot it in Vietnam because it sets it apart. It doesn't really feel like Vietnam. It doesn't feel hot and sweaty, and there's an absence of jungles for sure. But no, there's just something barren about it. It feels like just visiting all these strange abandoned cities, or like abandoned carnivals or something, abandoned amphitheaters. It has a post-apocalyptic sort of tone that is very surreal, and it is very removed from reality. And Kubrick does have a more fantasy, abstract quality to him, so it's fine. I will say, though, there is part of me that absolutely does agree. Like I said at the beginning, I always do struggle to connect emotionally in a humanistic sense to Kubrick films once you get to a certain point in his career. And I know a lot of people struggle with the pathos of this film and, wanting more richness, I suppose, to be captured emotionally. But I just miss the days when his movies were more like that, where there was a very stylistic quality to it. And it has that same sense of coldness and distance, but it's just not as overt. The themes just felt more complex and more well-balanced within all of the characters' interactions. There's just some sort of traction. That humanistic essence, I think, sort of breaks up the monotony of the rest. And I'm not saying I want that to a crazy degree, because again, I love that coldness, that distant quality that Kubrick has. I think it's very important. It's very important to his philosophy. But that being said, still recognizing that I find a lot of emotion coming out of very simple moments here that I think is more effective the more that you watch it. Even just with the two different stories. I mean, you look at the first story and it feels like that's purgatory. And then the second half is being plunged into hell. And yet we remain in this dangerous kind of psychological headspace as the shadow of the first half of the movie looms over the second. I find myself more defending Full Metal Jacket with perspective, now coming back to it many years later. I really appreciate its unique point of view. Still, even days later, I'm still thinking about it and still kind of mulling over how it makes me feel, because there are a lot of contradicting emotions within me, and a lot of complex emotions. It's like traveling through like a museum and just seeing paintings of people, not really knowing who they are, but yet you get a perfect sense of their world, through the artistic style and through, the environment depicted in the painting. And that's how I feel with Kubrick. It's like he captures just like these little, snippets, these little moments, all through different periods of history. And yet they all are tied together in a way. They all feel very timeless. It's like a prison cell with writing on the wall that you see. It's like you don't know who the prisoner was, and yet somehow it's like you can feel what they feel. And there's something very eerie about that, not knowing who the person was. And I think that is the power of this particular movie. That meditative silence is just right on the edge, and it is so uncomfortable, and nobody does that like Kubrick. It is just so effective. This is, as I said, it may not be my favorite Stanley Kubrick film, but I do appreciate more than I did originally. And of course, if you are a Kubrick fan and you haven't seen it, absolutely, please check it out. And if you just love film, please check it out. And that is the video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm going to plug my website. It is deepfocuslens.com. I am an artist, and I do commission portraits, and I sell prints of my work. If that's something you're interested in, you can always go to the website, deepfocuslens.com/shop. And if you have any questions about a commission or something like that, you can always email me. My email is in the description box below. Also, big shout out to my Patreon supporters. Thank you guys so much for your support. If you are interested in becoming a patron, the link to support is below for that, as well as my social media information. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.